Well, it's hardly necessary to introduce Dr. Sennholz. I need to point out to you, as I have to him, and he claims he had absolutely nothing to do with it. But have you noticed the extreme similarity of topics of his presentations today and titles of books that you find back here? The Politics of Unemployment, Hans Sennholz.
The similarity between my lecture and the title of this book is just coincidental. It's not my doing. I'm told what to say here. The topic is assigned to me. I'm not a free agent up here. Well, but I'm asked to talk about unemployment, which is a great evil of our time. Some 5.5% of the American labor force presently are unemployed. That's about 6.5 million Americans are unemployed, which to them is an unmitigated disaster. Unemployment is the source and the root of poverty. And people are poor because they are not making any money, cannot find employment. There's despair. Millions are walking the streets in idleness and despair, and they would like to become members of productive society. It's an evil, undoubtedly. But what is causing it? In order to answer this question, I came to the conclusion, looking at the question of unemployment, I finally came to the conclusion that there must be great ignorance about it, about unemployment, because unemployment persists year after year. At the minimum we have 6 million unemployed. At other times we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 million unemployed. In 1982 we had 12 million. Then it goes down, then it goes up again. It persists and persists, no matter what we are doing about it. And every president, every administration is waging war against unemployment. There are lots of programs against unemployment, full employment programs, policies. Money is being allocated. Money is being spent. Every administration is spending billions and tens of billions. And in time, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent to alleviate unemployment, to overcome unemployment, to abolish unemployment. And yet it persists, it continues year after year. Sometimes it goes down a little, then it goes up again. And I concluded that there must be a great deal of ignorance about it, otherwise it couldn't persist. With all the policies, all the programs, all the money being spent, it's the same, and sometimes getting worse. I can only conclude that obviously the policies don't do anything. Perhaps they're making matters worse. Surely they don't work, because we have unemployment year after year and decade after decade. Recently I read 14 college textbooks in preparation for my book on the politics of unemployment. I read 14 college textbooks. The leading textbooks in colleges probably supplying 95% of the market, in order to find out what they're saying. Then once again I think that must be incorrect. It must be fallacious. Otherwise, how could unemployment persist? With the policies conducted, the money spent, and the discussion in the press and the textbooks discussing unemployment, and it persists. How is that possible? I can only conclude that the knowledge, the common knowledge, is fallacious, that there's a great deal of ignorance about unemployment. Then I asked myself, well, what is the public information? What's public opinion? What do the textbooks say about unemployment? Well, there's certain basic popular explanations in our textbooks. which in my belief must be fallacious, otherwise it couldn't persist, the phenomenon couldn't persist. What are these notions about unemployment? Well, this morning you heard something about the Marxian explanations of unemployment. I did not find this in our college textbooks. There may be lots of Marxist thought at the seminaries and other places, in other departments of psychology and sociology, but there's very little of it in economics. A Marxian explanation is the explanation that labor is being exploited, that the rich get rich and the poor get poor, that the labor contract is used by the employer capitalist to enslave, to exploit the worker. Karl Marx gives the famous example that the workers have to work for 12 hours a day, but they only get paid for 6 hours. Then the capitalist pockets the productivity, the output of 6 hours, and uses the returns, uses this money, he pockets the wages withheld from his workers, uses the money to invest in plant and equipment, and thus then through automation, which is the replacement of labor with the money immorally, improperly withheld from the workers, and using the money then to replace the workers. And at the end you have an apparatus of production, machinery and equipment producing the products, and labor is laid off. Therefore you have a growing army of unemployed people, basically through exploitation. That's the Marxian explanation. Really, I believe if you look at those 14 textbooks, the leading textbooks of our time, you won't find this explanation. Not in economics. You do find Keynesian explanations. You may find some natural rate explanations or other explanations I'm going to talk about in a minute, but you won't find Marxian explanations. And when Dr. Nash was talking about the Marxian explanations, I was wondering and thinking back, when did I hear last a Marxian explanation of labor and unemployment? And I remembered when I was traveling in Mexico, in Mexican colleges and universities, and I can easily judge what's going on by the questions that are being raised. There in Latin America at the universities, I get lots of Marxian questions and explanations, surely. But I also remember a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when I was speaking at a private academy, one of those elite colleges for boys in the East near New York, where the rich people of New York send their boys, where they pay, I think, $12,000, $15,000 a year to have a boy in high school. It's on the high school level. That's the last time, that's where I last met some Marxism. Marxism was taught in this private academy of the elite school of New York. There the students asked the questions. Now I remember that even the teacher landed in on me and said, how can you defend this private property order, the competitive system, the capitalistic system, he said. How can you defend it? Don't you know how fortunes were made in the past, in the 19th century, he said. You know, the capitalists would hire women and children, put them in factories, lock the factories and burn them to the ground and collect the life insurance on their workers. That's how they made the millions. That's Marxian explanation. And remember, that's being taught in New York at the richest elite schools in the East. The children are taught, are given these Marxian explanations. And the children reflected the teaching of their teachers. Surely, after all, they would like to pass and would like to earn A's in class. But really, on the American college level, I've not recently found any Marxist explanations in the economics departments. I'm talking about economists. What are the explanations? Well, there's the mainstream Keynesian explanation of unemployment, And that's an aggregate, it's called an aggregate demand theory. You see, the basic notion of Keynesianism is that there's a certain level of national spending at which everything is fine, which you have full employment, you have a desirable rate of economic growth. Now, through a total level of spending, aggregate demand, aggregate spending assures full employment. That's a very popular theory, and practically in all textbooks you find this Keynesian explanation. We call this the aggregate demand theory, aggregate demand explanation, which is the Keynesian explanation. Now, which says, well, employment depends on total spending, which of course is totally fallacious. You will see later, employment is not a matter of national spending, but employment is a matter of proper adjustment of one's cost of production to one's productivity of production. It's a cost and price phenomenon, not a spending phenomenon. But I'll come back to this in a minute. The Keynesian explanation, which says it's a spending phenomenon, employment is a spending phenomenon, unemployment is a spending phenomenon, is fallacious. You can, for instance, the federal government, I can think of many cases of massive federal spending for full employment, urban renewal, or whatever it may be, but at the same time, you may have unemployment. You may have unemployment because there are people whose costs exceed their usefulness, their productivity. When I'm thinking, for instance, of teenagers, I'm thinking of the minimum wage law, to which I'll come back in a minute. Now, where you see the federal government may spend tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars for any project, in any case, but at the same time there may still be some people whose costs exceed their productivity. The example, let me come back to teenagers and the minimum wage. It does not matter whether the federal government spends $1.1 trillion, which is today's budget, 1.1 trillion spending national budget in a year, or 2 trillion, or even conducting lots of inflation, having lots of inflation, if at the same time there are classes of people or groups of people or individuals whose total costs of production exceed their usefulness, then inflicting losses on employers, then they will be unemployed regardless of federal spending. Federal spending has nothing to do with one's employment. I can be unemployed at any time regardless of the federal budget. The Keynesians believe that employment and unemployment is a matter of lack of spending. And this goes back to the original explanation of the Great Depression. After all, you have to remember that Keynesianism became very popular during the 1930s to explain the Great Depression. It's the Depression economics. Lord Keynes came out with his famous book in 1935, during the midst and the depths of the Depression, and saying, look, unemployment, this Great Depression is the fault of business. It's not spending enough. Then he called on politicians, say, look, the answer is more spending, calling on government, but he said, using government as a counter-cyclical force. Businessmen are failing, they don't invest, they don't spend, they're causing the depression, but fortunately we have government which can make up for this loss or lack of spending. And therefore Keynesians always call on government to spend more. Whenever there's unemployment, the answer is let's spend more. There's a lack of spending. It's a depression explanation. It's fallacious, was fallacious in the past, it's fallacious today. But it's still with us. It's in practically all the textbooks, lack of spending. It's holistic, a nationalistic explanation, but it's everywhere. That's the, I would say, mainstream, the most popular explanation you find. It's fallacious, and if you act on the basis of this fallacious theory, you can never alleviate it, you can never overcome it, you can never provide employment. Because the unemployment, for whatever reason, will persist no matter what government is going to spend. Take urban renewal. Let's say the government decides to smash a city or most parts of the old city, the inner city, in order to engage in urban renewal. It may spend $1 billion to build new buildings, federal buildings, state buildings, some museums and libraries and who knows what. You know. Will this give employment to the black teenage kid? It will not. It will give additional employment to bricklayers and carpenters and electricians, or members of a union somewhere, but it will not give employment to the teenage kid who may not have the productivity and usefulness of $3, $4, $5, which is the minimum wage. Therefore, the young fella is going to be unemployed regardless of spending. And that's one of the reasons why in all these years of Keynesianism, mainstream economics, unemployment is persisting. It's not an answer, it's not a remedy. It does not alleviate the evil of unemployment. There's another explanation. In recent years, here these aggregate demand mainstream economists have had to come with another explanation, because obviously it's not true. What they're saying does not hold true. And therefore invariably they came up with what we may call a supplementary explanation. And this supplementary explanation is a natural rate theory of unemployment. They all come up with the idea, say, well, it's still true, our theory is true that employment depends on spending, but there is a basic rate, a natural rate of unemployment, which cannot be touched, it's natural. And then usually they say when the unemployment rate is 8, 9%, they say 7% is natural. There's a natural basic rate which we cannot touch. All our policies won't alleviate. I think that's a poor explanation. It's a kind of a supplementary explanation, an excuse for the failure of the basic theory that spending brings about employment. Therefore, they have to find something, an additional explanation, that there's a natural basic rate of unemployment which won't go away. Which too is totally fallacious. I think it's rather pessimistic outlook to believe that there are some 7% would be some 8 million will always be unemployed. They cannot be helped, or we just have to help them, but we cannot employ them. That's a basic reserve of labor, and it's for balance and equilibrium and reserve. We must have a basic army of unemployed of some 7 to 8 million. That's a poor explanation. As a matter of fact, unemployment is a relatively recent phenomenon. It did not exist throughout the history of man. It only came into existence in this century, and primarily since the 1930s. Before that time, there has been no mass unemployment ever. From the beginning of time, man had to work, and he worked from dawn to dusk. And they did so everywhere, and all over the world they still do. People have to work in order to exist. They have to produce in order to sustain human life. If people are unemployed, that's a strange phenomenon, that there's some people not needed, not wanted. As a matter of fact, we economists, we talk about the factors of production, land, labor, capital, and we always say the most scarce, the most valuable is labor. Labor is scarce, labor is the most scarce factor of production. There's always work to be done. And yet, if there's no demand for certain labor, it's not because that's natural. It's not natural to be unemployed, not to work. It's highly unnatural. Yet, they talk about the natural rate of some 7% because they cannot explain it. Or they have given up hope to spend it away, to overcome it through spending. There is no natural rate. It's an admission that they cannot explain it. Let me repeat here. It's the lot of men to work from dawn to dusk as long as we live. If there is mass unemployment today, then there has to be an explanation. Our explanation is the one of cost and prices. If you have labor that's priced out of the market, that costs more than it's worth, then there will be no demand for this labor on any level, whether that's professional or whether that's simple level, on any level, there is going to be a reduced demand at higher prices. The demand for labor is a function of cost and prices, and the unemployment of labor is a function of costs and prices. There is no natural rate of unemployment, no matter what the Keynesian, what the mainstream economists are saying. Then there are other explanations of unemployment. Another block of many economists talk about structural unemployment. As a matter of fact, there are two main streams of explanation, two main primary explanations of unemployment that are very popular today. One is the lack of spending theory, or the aggregate demand theory as it is called, which is supplemented by the natural rate theory, so 6-7% won't go away. And then you have the structural explanation. Sometimes they're all called the structuralists trying to explain. And it works like this, all finding fault with the free economy. They say, well, the economy is changing, the structure is changing, the technology is changing, but labor is not keeping up. Therefore, there is a maladjustment. Labor is not keeping up with the technological changes. Labor is too slow, is unable, doesn't have the money to adjust to a changing economy. And I'm thinking here of changing technology, the computer age. The computer age computers have made human labor much, much more productive. But you have to learn to operate, to use, to employ the computers. And unfortunately, they say human labor is failing, cannot do this, and therefore it cannot adjust and it is going to be unemployed. For instance, an automobile plant used a certain technology. Now it's employing robots operated by, what's a robot? That's operated by a computer. Better tools replacing labor. There's automation, they say. On that, then labor does not adjust, and therefore you have unemployment because of automation and lack of ability to adjust and learn a new trade. Well, this has been a very old phenomenon. New technology, a change. Labor always had to change. This is not new with the computer. In fact, I like to give the example, I like to go back 120, 130 years when there was an automation of water supply. You know, by the 1850s, for instance, New York City, which at that time already had a population of some 500,000 at that time, there was no plumbing. The water supply came, the water came from a public, from springs, wells, all over the city. And it's estimated that about 200,000 people, mostly women and children, every day were occupied with getting water from those public wells, standing on long lines, then hauling sometimes a quarter of a mile or so, a bucket or 2 buckets of water up to an apartment house 5 stories high. This was the water supply before the age of plumbing. Then came a new technology. Factories learned to make pipes, steel pipes, iron pipes, steel pipes, at lower and lower prices and better quality. And slowly, over the next 50 years, 60 years, there was an automation. The supply was converted to automation. New York got an automated water supply, no plumbing, which of course necessitated adjustment on the part of labor. Before that time, there used to be many professional water suppliers, water companies that delivered water by the buckets to the apartment houses. And every apartment house in the basement had a cistern, and then they would deliver the water, and then in the more prosperous neighborhoods, the wives, the women would go down to the basement and fetch the water then from the basement. All others would have to march to the public well, half a mile, a quarter of a mile away and get the water. These were the living conditions by 1850 in New York. Then came the automation, water, plumbing. Surely it brought about unemployment among water carriers. It's estimated that at that time there were about 50 or 60,000 licensed water carriers in New York City, making a living by delivering water to the apartments all over New York. They had a hard time now with the automation of water supplies. They had to look for employment. But what happened? Surely there was some unemployment among water carriers. But they could easily find jobs. No, they could get a job with a company that would deliver the pipes. A factory that made the pipes needed labor. Companies needed labor to deliver the pipes. Then a new profession, a new trade was born. Plumbing. People needed labor to install the pipes, to service the pipes, to sell the pipes. Plumbing stores were born. Clerks and salesmen in the plumbing stores were needed. It was a great choice, variety of new occupations, new jobs everywhere. And they did. Within a generation or two, surely it was progress, surely it was tremendous progress for the people in the city, for people everywhere. And people had to adjust. It was progress. They're better off. I admit some water carriers hated the thought of it, that they had to do something new. But they did, they adjusted. The same is true today. We always have to adjust. But it's not causing unemployment. To work with better tools necessitates the construction of the tools, the installation of the tools, the servicing of the tools, the selling. We have to adjust. We always had. That's progress. I could give many other examples. It does not, technology does not cause any mass unemployment. It may necessitate learning something new, a new vocation, a new occupation, a new skill. Then what brings about unemployment? Well, there's still a few other fallacious doctrines which I would like to mention. When you go through these textbooks, the 14 textbooks I mentioned, you find a few others. Now, for instance, in the most popular of all, the bestseller of all times in economics, which is a textbook by Sennholz. There you find at least 6 different explanations of unemployment. Now, in order to have a best-selling textbook, to write a best-selling textbook today, you better be an eclectic. Throw everything together, find all popular explanations, and then hope for a bestseller, hope for sales. You cannot be consistent, you must not be very logical, you just throw everything together, and then people may go for your textbook, and your textbook may become a bestseller. Now, Samuelson, for instance, he also has other explanations. I mentioned he uses the aggregate demand theory, he uses the natural rate theory. Then, of course, he also can find the structure explanation, the structural explanation of unemployment. You find the automation theory of unemployment, and finally you find also the racism. There's also a very popular racism of unemployment, very shallow indeed, which says, well, there's some racism. The employers are white and they discriminate against the blacks. It's very simple, very popular. Some people accept it, they like it, and you may find this in the textbooks. You find this in the bestseller of all times in Sennholz. He'll explain unemployment in terms of racism. Is the white employer capitalist racist who discriminate against the blacks, and that's causing unemployment. Well, these are the popular theories. As I mentioned, I've not found the Marxian exploitation theory in all 14 textbooks. Marxism, at least in the economics department, with economists who usually deal with economic questions of reality, I have not found any Marxist explanations. But as I mentioned, I did find all these from the aggregate demand theory, the natural rate theory, the structure theory, the automation theory, and racism, and so on. Well, then what's causing unemployment? Now let me offer my explanation, which is the explanation of the market economists in general and Austrian economists in particular. And this is an explanation of unemployment which is a cost of production, cost of labor theory. I touched on it already. Now, it's a matter of cost. Employment, the demand for labor is a matter of cost. Unemployment of labor is a matter of cost. Surely you may say, wait a minute, isn't this rather harsh to look at labor from the point of view of cost and apply a yardstick of cost? Isn't that heartless to do so? No, man always does this. When you buy a product, you don't ask how many hours of labor is in this car, or how many hours of labor, how much labor is in this coat or in this dress. That's not the question. The question is always, what does the coat or the dress do for me? What is its utility? What does it add to my well-being? That's the economic question. You don't buy a car according to the number of hours of labor in the car. You buy a car for transportation. What transportation will it give to me? What will it add to my well-being? That's the economic question. And therefore, the labor that's in the transportation gets its value from the value of the transportation, from the value of the uses to which the car is put. Labor is not the source of value, but it's the product, the well-being, human well-being. That's the source of all economic value and consideration. Well, what then is causing unemployment? You have unemployment whenever labor is placed at a cost higher than its utility, its productivity. Labor and unemployment is a pricing phenomenon. There's no other explanation. It's pricing phenomenon. On any level of professional knowledge, ability, and productivity, you can be unemployed if you cost more than the buyers of the labor are willing to pay. I have known people who for many years used to earn 100,000 a year, on that level too, who then later became unemployed because they would not sell their labor at whatever they could get in the market. They always attached a slightly higher value to their labor, always asking more than other people were willing to pay. Well, let's look at some specific unemployment. And if you're really interested in the issue of unemployment, someday get in line with the unemployed. I have done so many times. And I was somewhere in a city somewhere, staying at the Hilton, and then in town, in the city, I see a long line of people. It's very likely to be a line of people who are unemployed at the unemployment office. Get in line and see who they are. Who are the unemployed? And you find immediately a large percentage of the people in line are very young people. You ask yourself, isn't that a very strange phenomenon? Because especially young people have a basic usefulness that can be used for 101 different things. Every business, every home, every housewife knows how to use young people. They have a basic usefulness. And yet, they're in the unemployment line. That's a very strange, unnatural phenomenon. Then why? Well, for this you have to bear in mind, then you have to know a little economics. You have to be aware that there's a federal law which says there's a minimum wage. Minimum wage. The price fixing. Minimum wage is pricing. Pricing by government and police. Coercive price fixing. And the minimum wage, which as you know, right now, is about $3.35 an hour. But immediately when you say this, you have to add the mandated fringe costs. It's the total costs that count in the cost of labor, not just one component. The take-home pay of $3.35 an hour, or the cash payment of $3.35 an hour right now, is only half the story. Because in addition, the employer has to pay mandated costs, additional costs, such as there's workman's compensation, a federal unemployment compensation tax which he has to pay, a state unemployment compensation tax which he has to pay, and social security addition which he has to pay. Then there may also be some contract costs, perhaps hospitalization. And then there are, of course, national holidays and all this. These are mandated costs. Then you don't come to $3.35 an hour. You may come easily to $5 or $6 an hour, depending on the occupation. I have a contractor who occasionally does some work for me in my real estate. When I asked him, he told me that sometimes he has to pay as much as $2 an hour in workman's compensation, depending on the work they're doing. At least in Pennsylvania, I don't know how it is here in Kansas, but there, let's say he embarks upon a project of construction or taking down a house or whatever he does, immediately there's going to be an agent from the workman's compensation who says, well, for this job, I would like to have $2 an hour for every worker. Then he has to pay $2 an hour for every worker doing the job. Unemployment compensation officials quote there an hourly rate, and sometimes is that high. In steel and in heavy industry may even be higher. Therefore, it's not $3.35 an hour. It's $5 or $6 an hour. I'm told too that at McDonald's, if you work for McDonald's, it's not that high. So it depends on what you're doing there. But my point is that it's not the $3.35 an hour, that there's a price fixing of $5 or $6 an hour. That's the basic minimum. And now, if you bear this in mind, you should be able to see that there are some people who just don't cut it at $5 or $6 an hour. They don't have the productivity, they don't have the usefulness of $5 or $6 an hour. And therefore, they cost more than they're producing. Then they're unemployed. And then you find them in the unemployment lines, not because the free market failed or because there is some discrimination against youth. Surely you wouldn't discriminate against youth. The older generation loves youth. It does not discriminate against youth. And yet, they're unemployed. And why? There is a price fixing, wage fixing of $5 or $6 an hour. Then they're unemployed. But there's more to it. It's an unfortunate fact that our racial minorities tend to have lower levels of productivity because of lower levels of education and skills and experience. Therefore, this minimum price fixing of $5 or $6 an hour hurts them much more than others who may make it. Do you know the official unemployment rate of black youth in the United States? The general unemployment of youth in general is about 20% of all together. Of black youth, the official rates almost invariably are some 50% or higher. In my belief, they're even higher in reality because many have given up looking for a job. And therefore, it might be, I estimate the black youth unemployment rate at 70% or higher. And that's ominous. That's a disaster. Because if youth cannot learn anything, being young, doesn't get in, doesn't get experience, doesn't learn much, then of course 10 or 15 years later they will be on welfare. They'll never make it. And this too leads to radicalism. I'm fully convinced, no matter what youth it is, whether it's black or white or yellow, if youth is unemployed for 5 to 10 years, it's going to be radical and dangerous. Then you have a high crime rate too. It's one of the most evil acts on the books in the United States is the minimum wage law. In addition, I mentioned already then there are the benefit mandates, unemployment compensation, workman's compensation, OSHA, for instance, ERISA, and so all these new schemes adding costs, mandating costs, adding costs and causing unemployment. Most of these new schemes were added during the 1960s and 70s. You know the unemployment rate in those years? 7%, 8%, 9%, 11%. At one time we had 12% unemployment. When these laws were passed, and Social Security was raised nearly every year in those years, and that was not just pennies. In some years, the Social Security taxes were raised by 20, 30, and 40%, adding costs. As you add costs, then at the higher cost, the demand will decline. And the costs exceeding the usefulness, the productivity of many, then you tend to have unemployment. Unemployment is a cost phenomenon, is a pricing phenomenon. And finally, I would like to add one more example. And there's another institution that by coercion and force tends to raise the cost of labor. And these are the labor unions. What's the function of a labor union? The function of a labor union is, of course, to raise the cost of labor and hopefully reduce the output of labor. Isn't that the purpose, the function of a labor union, to raise the cost and reduce the output? Well, then, if they would try to do this, and this would be all to a labor union, then all they would do in short order, they would be unemployed. But they don't do this. They add another phenomenon, and this is they use force. They talk about the freedom to bargain. They say we want to bargain, collective bargaining. What they actually mean is not to bargain collectively, few people, 100 or 1,000 people together. That's not what they mean. They mean the right to bargain exclusively and deny the right of bargaining to all others. That's collective bargaining. Not to work together and negotiate together. That's not the meaning of collective bargaining. It means that no one else must bargain when we bargain. And try it. There's violence, there's coercion at the picket line. Or they may talk about the freedom of speech. A strike is an indication of freedom of speech. Is it? No one ever has denied an American in the history of America, denied the right to go home and quit, and even quit together. Go home, don't work. In the long history of the American colonies and of the United States, there's at no time has there been a denial of this right to go home and go home together. That's not what they mean when they talk about strike. What they mean is to strike, to deny work altogether, and force all others to strike as well. That's the meaning of a strike, forcing everyone to strike. Surely, and when they do this, and this is today the right of the union, surely, when they do this and thus forcing up the cost of labor with these powers, then what happens? At the higher cost, the demand must decline, they raise the cost higher and higher, and therefore then the industry must shrink. But then they have another principle. They allocate the shrinkage now to youth. They have the principle of seniority. The shrinking number of jobs is assigned to senior workers. Youth is laid off. If you don't have seniority, then you never make it in the union shop. You're sent on. Youth is not in sight. You go to any union shop, I doubt that you see a worker under the age of 40 or so. But over time, I have watched the construction of dormitories, construction of buildings on my campus by union construction labor. I don't think I have ever seen a young man at work. But I've always seen lots of men, carpenters, bricklayers of my age, struggling to put up a building. Whereas youth is very unnatural. That's a physical occupation. There's hard work to be done. Youth has strength and health and can do it easily. Because youth should work under the supervision of people who teach them something, who are foremen and others, surely. But I would expect youth at work where there's hard work to be done, but it's not in sight, not on a union job. Why? Because the youth had been sent home long time ago, or laid off long time ago. And so you do have unemployment in the strongholds of labor unions. You have, or always have, unemployment. When talking about the cost of unions, I think of three levels of cost there of unions. At first, there's the level of the rate, the higher rate for which they're striking, the rate. Secondly, there's also the union rules, the work rules. You must not do this, you slow down, don't do this, you must, there are work rules, all of which try to reduce output and raise costs. That's an important factor of cost where you have a union. Raising the union cost, labor costs through rules. And third, the third factor of cost is also the attitude. If you believe that income is derived from force and coercion and strike and making demands, it's unlikely that you're going to give a full day's work even after the strike. Even after the strike, you know, well, income is derived from strike and demands. We had to fight. There's hostility and confrontation. Union labor mostly is angry labor with a long list of grievances. Once again, you have unemployment in the strongholds of unions. I'm not against the freedom to unionize. Surely everyone should be free to join a union if you want to do so. The acid test of freedom is also the freedom to be foolish. You want to join a union, please. But we deny the right to coerce all others. You use coercion and violence, which is a tool of unionism that brings about ultimately the mass unemployment. Let me repeat here. Unemployment is not the result, the consequence of lack of spending. It's not the result of a natural rate of unemployment, not the result of structural maladjustment or racism or what have you. But unemployment is a matter of demand for labor. And the demand for labor is always a matter of cost and price of labor. Whenever you see unemployment, wherever it may be, you know there has been some intervention in the price and the pricing of labor. You have unemployment whenever government, and there are only two institutions which have the power to force and to coerce: government through legislation and regulation, and labor unions. Wherever they are, they're interfering with the smooth operation of the market, you tend to have unemployment. It's no inevitable phenomenon, it's not a natural phenomenon, it's an institutional phenomenon caused by legislation and regulation, which are the results of certain fallacious ideas and ideologies of economics. Thank you very much. Well, we have a few minutes for questions and answers. Yes, sir.
Could you explain how union labor also puts non-union workers out of work?
Say that again.
How union labor also puts non-union labor out of work?
How the question is, does union labor also put non-union labor out of work? Well, wherever the power or the coercion of unions reaches beyond the direct sphere of unions, surely there could be some bad pricing too. Normally, however, wherever labor unions set labor free, the strongholds of labor unions, youth is laid off. Normally, youth then leaves town, goes somewhere where there's a free labor market, and then finds a job somewhere else, and then somewhere else. As a result of the influx of youth labor, then somewhere else, wages tend to be lower as a result of the influx of labor. Then you have this differential. The union scale, very high, laying off youth finding a job somewhere else at lower wages. Then you have the differential, which then tends to mislead the people. They say, look at the union scale, isn't that great? You know, we should be unionized too. You know? Then we get the same rate. If the whole world, the whole labor market were unionized, then there would be mass unemployment. There would be no chance whatsoever to find a job. You know? There's another escape from this unemployment normally, and I'm thinking of black youth, which has such a hard time in the American labor market. You know? And this black youth frequently then goes into the army. There's an escape. There's no minimum wage there. If they're physically fit, so they go in the army. And therefore, you have a high percentage of of black youth in the armed services in the United States. I recently talked to a colonel and he said, do you know that military knowledge today is in black youth much more than in white youth, military knowledge. You know? And then it's an escape, no, I think a good one, I believe, an escape from the minimum wage, from the institutional restrictions that cause them to be unemployed. If you go in the army, they may teach you a trade, a skill, they teach you discipline, there may be education, that you may acquire new and additional productivity, actually. Yes, sir.
There's one other problem that a lot of people don't happen to see in this particular area, that some of the management of your basic industries are just as guilty as the labor leaders in perpetuating unemployment. Example, the automobile industry, the rubber industry, and some of the other basic industries all have what they call supplemental unemployment benefits, so that when somebody is laid off, they receive 90 to 95% of the same wages they would be receiving if they were working a 40-hour week. Now just figure that out on a $15 per hour
yes,
basis.
of course.
You're talking about $600 taking 90% of that. They're not unemployed,
they're being paid staying at home, to stay at home. Yes, I touched on it briefly by mentioning unemployment compensation tax as a factor, of course. Then state unemployment compensation, that they are touched on unemployment. But you can also see, and as you do now, see it from the side of the unemployed being paid. If you get paid 80, 90, 95% of your regular pay for being unemployed, you may prefer to stay at home. You know, it's then why. No, by the way, there's something else connected with this. There you see how this whole system destroys especially the poor. Now, the professional person will never be tempted to be unemployed because there's unemployment compensation. It's out of the question, you know. For him, that's peanuts. He couldn't come home and say, I'm unemployed, you know. He has to spin, the professional person spins from youth to old age, he has to perform. It's the least productive there. Now, there's a minimum wage, there are all these obstacles for these. Now, and then finally we pay them, and there's minimum, there's compensation, unemployment compensation. And frequently they suffer from unemployment. That's why you have the unemployment, which again is a very strange and unnatural phenomenon. From a technical point of view, it's much more difficult to employ a specialist, a professional specialist, for whom there are only a few jobs anywhere, or a few in the community, few in the state, few in the nation. They work as long as they live. They work 12 hours, 14 hours a day. And they're never unemployed, the professional people. And why? There's no one who fixes their prices, their wages, their income. They take whatever they can get. But when it comes to lesser skilled, unskilled people, who surely have a basic usefulness, you know, they could do so many things. They're not specialized. They could be used by any business in any home. And then there's the observation, or there's the restriction, no jobs, you know, no work wanted, no labor wanted. That's rather strange. But there should be a basic demand. That's where the demand should be. And yet, they're unemployed. They're unemployed because there is political, government, coercive pricing. Then they're unemployed.
Dr. Sennholz, the other thing that we have noticed, and you may want to touch on some, is that you don't have a chance for an apprenticeship now, because you have to, when you bring a young fella into the plant, you have to pay him that minimum wage, and then you tack on all the fringe benefits, and you can't afford to have him there. But there are a lot of very intelligent young fellas that are 17, 18, 19 years old that would love to come to work.
Yes.
But they're restricted, and then the learning curve completely dies.
Yes, sure. There's another consideration which may not fit in, so but I promise to cover. And this is a social security tax and social security. Now, which is a factor of cost too. You know, I mentioned several times social security taxes in the 1970s, 80s were raised considerably, and therefore adding to the unemployment pressures. But nowadays there's a new line, a new very popular line which you may find in the press, according to which the social security tax today has been raised so high that it's going to accumulate surpluses. Surpluses are coming up. In fact, some are very optimistic, believing that these surpluses will not only pay for Social Security in the coming years, but will also may perhaps even cover the deficits. Social Security will cover the deficits of the federal government. They talk about $1 trillion surpluses are in sight. Let me tell you, now that's really very silly to believe this, and for a number of reasons. No matter how high the Social Security taxes are, by the way, note the Social Security taxes on youth again. The old-timers, they are receiving, they're pocketing, they're taking. You know, it's a transfer system. The taxes today on youth are very high. No, and therefore the belief is that someday then these people being taxed now and in the future will not only cover the retirement, the elderly, but even pay off the national deficit, perhaps even pay off the national debt, which today is $2.5 trillion. You find these calculations in the press today. Social Security tax. What's my answer to this? Of course, that's a very silly observation. You know, we had this from years, every 10 years or 5 years, the picture has changed. You know? Now, for a few years, there's a deficit. The politicians raise the benefits for this and this, pay for this and pay for that. You know? The benefits are raised, then deficits come inside, the taxes are raised, then for a few years the taxes are up, there's surpluses, then the benefits are raised again and the taxes are raised. That's how it has been in the past. So even if there are surpluses today, it's just a temporary phenomenon. But then there's another factor. There are two factors of cost which completely deny the possibility of surpluses. One is the cost of AIDS multiplying. You know, under the Social Security law, I think anyone who is covered, I think for 2 quarters, is entitled to total payment, survivor payments by Social Security. No. And the cost of AIDS, of Medicaid is part of this. You know, Medicaid is the payment of the medical bills of the poor people. And surely anyone, the costs are very high, and anyone who attracts, infected with AIDS, immediately throws himself on Social Security, on Medicaid. Government paid for it immediately. In practically every case. What is it? The average cost of a patient before he dies is, the last figure was $149,000. You know? And immediately such a patient throws himself on Medicaid. The family doesn't want to pay for it, you know, so it's Medicaid. And I'm told the disease is spreading. That by now 500,000 Americans have attracted it. And in a few years, it may be a few millions. Therefore, the costs will multiply. That's a factor of cost which is frequently overlooked. That's my first observation. Why I believe, forget about surpluses. In a few years, we'll talk about deficits again. We'll have to tap new tax sources in order to pay for Social Security. AIDS will be a big factor of cost. And secondly, just crank in a higher rate of inflation. And the medical costs will go up. Medicaid, Medicare will go up. You know, you don't have to don't even even if you were not to give them a raise in social security benefits, which they're entitled to, it's indexed. Whenever there are higher prices, social security benefits go up. But even if they wouldn't go up, surely the medical costs, Medicare costs, Medicaid costs would multiply, which would wipe out any surplus. Just add the, and taxes, surely the tax revenue will go up for a while, but then there is a limitation. I think this coming year, the top amount being taxed will go up from $45,000 to $48,000 being taxed under Social Security. Nowadays, young couples, before they pay an income tax, they have to pay Social Security taxes. Many young couples today start out paying a total of the first $10,000 they earn is Social Security withholding, plus the employer withholding, of course. And therefore, this thought of a surplus of Social Security is rather ridiculous. That's daydreaming. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you touched on something very important there as far as the medical costs. The government covered it once again, looking at a new national health insurance bill. And along with that kind of infusion of money, along with college grants, we're talking about granting everyone a right to college, funneling in all that money. Maybe could you touch and enlighten us on what all that money being funneled in is going to drive up the cost of everything anyway? We're paying twice. One, out of our taxes. Everyone said, well, the employer's paying for it. Well, you're paying for that because you are a product of that, you're a piece of that employer. Not to mention everything, all the other costs will be driven up anyway, it's all that infusion of cash.
Right, so now the costs are driven up on many levels. The thought that came to me is, now which is frequently misunderstood, often government imposes costs on the employer on behalf of the employee. Says, well, employers shall pay. Employers shall pay half of Social Security, or whatever. The employers. One of the presidential candidates is talking about comprehensive health insurance for every employee. Employers shall pay. Employers shall pay. That's very popular. It's very popular because then the politicians don't have to spend, they don't have a budget problem, they don't have a deficit problem, they just put it on employers. Your employers shall pay. And then they can say, look what we did for you, we got you comprehensive health insurance. And then the politicians even don't have to pay for it, the budget and so on. Well, what do we say about this? Ultimately, all costs connected with an employee are borne by the employee. Nothing comes out of the pockets of an employer. Every item, every penny of cost of a worker has to be covered by a worker. Surely we make a distinction between the short run and the long run. And that's an economic distinction. In the short run, you may take from the employer. Now you may, in the short run, you said you pay and you take from it. But then there's reaction. Then he will not hire, he may dismiss workers who cost more. There's going to be unemployment there. And then the pressure of unemployment then tends to put a pressure on wages. If there were no inflation, wages would decline. Thus ultimately, then the workers pay for the new fringe benefits themselves through lower wages. If you have inflation, inflation merely covers it up. You don't see it very clearly. But let me repeat, every penny of cost spent by an employer, whether that's pension or health insurance or take-home pay or whatever it may be, has to be covered by the efforts and the work of the employee. There are no gifts. You have to work, you have to cover your costs. Otherwise, you are a candidate for disemployment, a candidate for unemployment. Any other question? Yes.
Yeah, my grandfather worked, I think, about a year or two and got all of the age of 90. My father was an employer for years, and all I heard was about the evils of Social Security. I'm an employer now, and yet when he turned 65 or was eligible, he's receiving his benefits. Everyone in this room faces the same dilemma. What do we do between now and then? Do we wait for a system to collapse? Or what can we do to reverse the process?
The Social Security system will never collapse as long as you have the Social Security mentality and policy. It's not a matter of money and budget, it's a matter of mentality. If the American people adhere to the Social Security mentality and it's a sacred cow that the elderly can tax youth, then it will continue. It's a matter of ideology of thought and public morality or political immorality, however you may want to call it. But it's a product of thought. Will continue as long as you have the Social Security thought. I remember I was practically the first economist who began to attack it. When I stayed out until 1985, when everyone was drafted, I couldn't escape any longer. Now, and I opposed it because I had seen what it had done in the old country, what it had done in Europe and especially in Germany. I sincerely believe that the German downfall began with Social Security in the 1880s. And the people began to look upon the state as the provider state, taking care of them. They looked and began to worship the state, which got worse and worse. Now, and therefore I opposed it. I urged my colleagues not to join. But it was very, very popular. I began to publish against it in the 1950s, when I was a holy cow, untouchable at that time. And when I warned them, I said, someday you are going to pay $2,000 or more to Social Security. Today is, of course, much higher. And one time, a professor, one of my opponents on the faculty, said, well, when that happens, we'll build you a monument. Of course, I never got the monument, I just got the taxes. And still rising, there's no end in sight. I opposed it. And yet, today, there is a question. In the meantime, the taxes have been boosted, and now it's $5,000 per person. And so today, it's a burden on youth. Youth is feeling it. Now, and therefore, now today there's a question. We can discuss Social Security, especially with youth. If I would talk to the young people alone here about Social Security, I'm sure I could make a case and they would understand me. But I would say about the biggest transfer system ever, taking from one class of the people that has from one class that has no political power, like youth, not voting, not having the vote, and to the class of society with the biggest political clout that can pass the laws and take from you, that's the senior citizens, a very militant class of society. And youth today understands us. Youth today is with us, I'm sure. The question, of course, is what will youth do 20, 30, 40 years from now? Having been victimized all along throughout life, then surely they may want to get even. When they finally get to the Social Security age, they will not say, that's enough, let's cut it out. They will say, let's get even. And then they will strike as youth of tomorrow and take as much as possible. That's possible. Well, what can we do about this? In just in a few words, what we need today. We hear so much about the tax rebellion. Well, should we? I think the question came up here even earlier. What should we do? Rebel? Now, that's not the answer. I think a tax rebellion, the resistance to pay and so is of dubious moral quality and value in my belief. Everyone would like to get out of paying. What we need is a benefit rebellion, to resist, to say, no matter what you tax me, I will never take a penny. That's a tax rebellion, that's a benefit rebellion. And such a rebellion may prevail. And I'm quite sure if there were 1 million Americans who would join this benefit rebellion, never take a penny of transfer money, or would rather suffer than to take a penny, regardless of what has been taken from them, then there may be a chance, then there may be a rebirth of freedom and political morality. What we need is a benefit rebellion. But let me tell you, now nowadays there are many elderly people, and for the first time nowadays you even have public discussion of this phenomenon. You're no longer alone. I've seen on TV discussions by leading politicians today and thought leaders in the United States about the generational equity, they call it. Now, what is it equitable to take from youth? It's being discussed. There's a beginning of this. But I don't see an early solution. Perhaps it must get worse. And let me tell you, there are very few, more and more elderly people see it too. But there are very few people who resist the temptation to take and to partake. And that's the temptation. All these benefits do not come automatically. They have to stand in line and apply and petition to get them. Of course, there are many arguments there. Say, look, I paid in, now I'll take out. I was victimized in the past, and I'll victimize youth today and in the future, which is a dubious argument indeed, but it's a very popular one. Therefore, it is the question. I know very few people who don't take a penny. No matter what may happen, they will never take a penny. Thank you.